Well, I have bad news for you today that I'd like to discuss. The latest report shows that U.S. employers announced 108,435 layoffs in January alone. This is an increase of 205% from December, from just a month prior. This is the highest January total since 2009. Welcome back to the program, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for being here. If you're new, please subscribe to Newsix Brief to get more exclusive content. The United States labor market is quietly deteriorating. That's the truth, and there's no denying that. The numbers were revealed in a new report from Challenger, Gray, and Christmas, showing that U.S.-based employers announced more than 108,000 job cuts in January alone. That's up sharply from about 35,000 in December. So compare 35,000 in December and then an increase to 108,000 layoffs in January. Year over year, compared to last January 2025, this is a staggering 118% increase. In fact, this was the highest number of job cuts announced in any January since 2009, right in the depth of the Great Recession. According to the report, most of these layoff plans were set at the end of 2025. That actually means that companies entered 2026 already very pessimistic about growth, about consumer demand, and about profitability. Yes, layoffs often cluster in the first quarter. That's been the trend for many years, and that's normal. But this was not a normal January. What's different here, and what's very concerning, is that hiring intentions collapsed at the same time. Companies announced plans to hire just over 5,300 workers in January. Now, for the United States, that is nothing. This is the lowest number ever recorded for the month of January since Challenger began tracking this data in 2009. This is absolutely unprecedented. We need to take this seriously. When layoffs rise and when hiring plans dry up simultaneously, as we see now, this signals something deeper than routine corporate belt-tightening or just trying to cut costs. Nearly half of the announced job cuts came from just 3 companies: Amazon, UPS, and Dow. Amazon plans to eliminate around 16,000 corporate roles as part of an internal restructuring. UPS announced as many as 30,000 cuts, which are largely tied to its gradual wind-down of its delivery relationship with Amazon. Dow is cutting about 4,500 positions as it restructures operations in response to weaker demand and higher costs. Other companies followed suit too. Nike announced workforce reductions. Peloton trimmed staff again. And these are not startups, of course. These are large, established firms that are being forced to adjust to a tougher environment. And if these firms are laying off thousands of employees, which doesn't look good on paper, doesn't look good for their shareholders, what should we expect from smaller and mid-sized companies? The official reasons cited for the layoffs tell their own story, and that's something I'd like to focus on next. Contract losses were the biggest driver, followed closely by broader economic conditions and restructuring. In other words, companies are seeing less demand, fewer reliable revenue streams, and they're experiencing significant pressure to cut costs before conditions worsen. That's the truth. Now, as expected, artificial intelligence also showed up as a factor for these layoffs, with more than 7,600 job cuts attributed to AI-related efficiencies. While that number is smaller than some headlines may suggest, the direction is very clear. Executives are increasingly prioritizing automation and efficiency over hiring. Even when companies are not actively laying people off, they're choosing not to replace roles that can be automated or absorbed by smaller teams using new technology. And so that fits into a broader pattern that's been developing for over a year now, and I've been discussing it here on Newsix Brief for at least 12 months. We're seeing the so-called low-hire, low-fire labor market. Layoffs haven't exploded across the board, but hiring has slowed to a crawl. Job openings have steadily declined, and workers are finding fewer opportunities to move or to negotiate higher pay. New data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics reinforces this picture. At the end of December, job openings fell to about 6.5 million. This is the lowest level since September of 2020, during the pandemic downturn. Hiring rates, quit rates, and layoff rates all remained relatively steady, but at subdued levels. So what's the key takeaway here? Well, this is not a healthy, expansionary labor market. Of course, this is stagnation. And for job seekers, this is very, very painful. As economists point out, job openings are a forward-looking indicator. They reflect what employers plan to do in the future, not what they've already done. And so a decline in openings signals hesitation, uncertainty, and a lack of confidence about the future. And uncertainty is everywhere right now. Economists have noted that sweeping policy shifts under the Trump administration, such as tariffs and immigration changes, have added another layer of uncertainty and unpredictability to the labor market. Companies are struggling to plan ahead, and instead of expanding payrolls, many are delaying decisions, effectively conserving cash, and trying to experiment with automation and AI rather than committing to long-term hiring. That is terrible for job seekers. This helps explain, of course, why the so-called hiring recession doesn't appear close to ending anytime soon. Private sector job growth in January was very weak. According to ADP, companies added just 22,000 jobs last month. This was the worst January reading since the pandemic-related downturn in 2021. Nearly all of that growth came from healthcare, which continues to hire regardless of the broader cycle. But outside of healthcare, hiring was very, very slow. Initial jobless claims added another layer of concern here. First-time unemployment claims jumped to about 231,000 at the end of January. This is an 8-week high. While that number isn't alarming on its own, the trend does matter. Claims have been hovering near 2-year lows, and this jump actually suggests that layoffs are starting to filter through to official data. As you can see, this environment is very unsettling. Fewer job openings mean less bargaining power. Slower hiring means fewer opportunities to move up or to switch roles, to negotiate better pay. Even if layoffs remain somewhat contained in the future, fear alone can change behavior. It changes consumer behavior. People tend to spend less. They try to save more if they can, and they certainly pull back on big purchases when they sense that there's risk in the job market, that they may lose their job. They're not going to spend. In other words, consumer demand is likely to be impacted. It is likely to weaken even more. And that feedback loop matters here, because consumer spending drives the U.S. economy. A fragile labor market, as we see right now, it is deteriorating, doesn't need to collapse to slow growth. It just needs to make people nervous enough to pull back their spending habits. The Federal Reserve continues to argue that the unemployment rate is showing signs of stabilization. Now, it's fair to be very skeptical. Stabilization at a weaker level is not the same as strength. The labor market is cooling. It is collapsing. What makes this moment tricky is that it doesn't look like past downturns. There's no sudden spike in unemployment. There's no dramatic crash in hiring either. But instead, this is a grind. Fewer openings, fewer hires, more restructurings, more talk of efficiency, more pressure on workers to do more with less. And this is not a good scenario. This is a deteriorating labor market. And so it will be really interesting to see how far that weakness actually spreads within the next several months. Let me expand on what this deteriorating labor market really means for the broader economy and for individual workers, because the implications extend far beyond the monthly statistics we're seeing. What we're witnessing is a fundamental shift in the relationship between employers and employees, and it's happening in a way that's both subtle and profound. First, let's talk about what this means for wage growth and worker bargaining power. For the past few years, workers enjoyed a rare period of leverage. The post-pandemic labor shortage meant companies had to compete for talent, offering higher wages, better benefits, and more flexibility. Workers could quit jobs they didn't like and quickly find new ones, often at higher pay. That era is over. In a low-hire, low-fire environment, workers lose their most powerful tool, the ability to leave. When job openings are scarce and hiring is slow, threatening to quit becomes an empty threat. Employers know this, and it changes the entire dynamic. Wage growth slows. Benefit improvements stop. Flexibility gets clawed back. Workers find themselves in a position of weakness they haven't experienced in several years. This has enormous implications for inflation and the Federal Reserve's policy decisions. One reason inflation stayed elevated for so long was strong wage growth. Workers had bargaining power and used it to demand higher pay, which companies passed on to consumers through higher prices. Now, with that bargaining power evaporating, wage growth will slow, which should help bring inflation down. But it comes at a cost. Workers' standard of living stops improving, or even declines in real terms. The Federal Reserve might view this as a positive development. They want to cool the labor market to fight inflation. But there's a fine line between cooling and breaking. If the labor market weakens too much, consumer spending collapses, and the economy tips into recession. The Fed is trying to thread an incredibly narrow needle, and the margin for error is shrinking. Now let's talk about the role of artificial intelligence and automation in this deterioration. The 7,600 job cuts attributed to AI might seem small, but it represents something much larger, a fundamental shift in how companies think about labor. For decades, automation replaced manual and routine jobs: factory workers, data entry clerks, switchboard operators. But AI is different. It's coming for knowledge workers, for roles that were supposed to be immune to automation. When companies announce layoffs due to AI-related efficiencies, they're not just cutting costs in the short term. They're signaling that they view human labor as increasingly optional, replaceable, something to be minimized rather than invested in. This creates a psychological shift in how employers approach hiring. Why bring on new employees when AI might be able to handle the work in 6 months? Why expand the team when you can stretch the existing team using new tools? This mindset becomes self-reinforcing. Companies hesitate to hire, which means fewer job opportunities, which means workers have less bargaining power, which means companies feel even more comfortable delaying hiring decisions. It's a vicious cycle that's very difficult to break once it starts. The sectoral dimension of this weakness is also crucial. Healthcare continues to hire because you can't automate away the need for nurses and doctors, at least not yet. But almost every other sector is slowing. Technology companies, which led hiring for years, are now leading layoffs. Retail is struggling with weak consumer demand. Manufacturing faces tariff uncertainty. Logistics companies like UPS are restructuring as e-commerce growth slows. What this means is that there are fewer and fewer safe havens for workers. It used to be that if one sector was struggling, workers could pivot to another. But when weakness spreads across sectors simultaneously, there's nowhere to pivot to. You're just competing for a shrinking pool of opportunities with an ever larger pool of desperate job seekers. The policy uncertainty dimension cannot be overstated. Companies hate uncertainty more than almost anything else. They can adapt to high taxes or strict regulations if they're predictable. But when they don't know what tariffs will be imposed next month, or which industries will face new restrictions, or whether immigration policy will change again, they freeze. They stop making long-term commitments, especially hiring commitments. This is particularly damaging because hiring is inherently a long-term decision. When you bring someone on, you're committing to months of training, integration, and productivity ramp-up before you see returns. Companies won't make that commitment if they think the rules might change dramatically in 3 months. So they wait, they delay, they pause hiring, and workers pay the price. There's also a generational dimension to this deterioration that's worth considering. Young workers entering the labor market right now are facing conditions they've never experienced before. For college graduates from the classes of 2020 to 2023, the labor market was remarkably strong. They had multiple job offers, signing bonuses, remote work options. The class of 2026 is entering a completely different world. One where getting any job offer is an achievement, where competition is fierce, where expectations need to be dramatically lowered. This matters because early career experiences shape workers' entire career trajectories. People who enter the labor market during recessions earn less over their entire lives, change jobs less frequently, and advance more slowly. We might be creating a lost cohort of workers whose careers are permanently damaged by entering the market at exactly the wrong time. Looking forward, the question is whether this deterioration accelerates or stabilizes. The optimistic scenario is that we've seen the worst of it. Companies have made their cuts, right-sized their operations, and will slowly start hiring again as uncertainty clears. The pessimistic scenario is that we're in the early innings of a much deeper downturn, where today's layoffs lead to reduced consumer spending, which leads to weaker corporate revenues, which leads to more layoffs, creating a downward spiral. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but the risks are clearly tilted toward further weakness. When hiring intentions are at record lows, when job openings are at pandemic levels, when major companies are cutting tens of thousands of jobs, these are not signs of an economy poised for robust growth. These are warning signals that should not be ignored. For individual workers, the message is clear. This is a time for caution, for building up financial cushions, for investing in skills that are harder to automate, for being more flexible about job requirements and expectations. The labor market that existed 3 years ago is gone, and it's not coming back anytime soon. Adapting to this new reality is essential for navigating the challenging period ahead. Thank you very much for watching Nuzik's Brief. I hope this video was interesting. If that's the case, please make sure you support my work, like subscribe and share. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you back here in the next video. Bye for now.